Yeah. Good day to you all. It's a pleasure to introduce Gerard Delanty, very influential in sociological theory, chief editor of the European Journal of Social Theory, but he hasn't just been in European thinking, but also very international. I think that with Brian Turner and his critique of Max Weber's work, Delanty, Gerard has been one of the people to bring in Eastern thinking into social theory. For instance, in his work, The Cosmopolitan Imagination of 2009, he has been visiting professor in Japan, in Brazil, also at York University and Toronto. And Gerard is of Irish origin, worked at Liverpool University, more recently at Sussex University, and his recent work includes a book on critical theory and social transformation, and also a handbook on social and political theory. And also recently, last year, his edited volume, so timely, Gerard, on pandemics, society and politics, the COVID-19 pandemic critical reflections. And Gerard, COVID is back on the front page, also in Barcelona, I'm sure. And with Omicron and the travel bans, which make a lot of people very nervous. So, Gerard, it will be great to hear your reflections. Welcome to you, a warm welcome, and welcome to you all participants. Please, Gerard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for inviting me to give this talk in your series, and thanks for your introduction. Yes, I'm delighted to talk on this topic. Not an expert on pandemics, nor on issues of health and medicine, but many people, many not just sociologists who busied themselves during the pandemic period, especially during the early lockdown, which already seems a long time ago with the pandemic. I did myself, and my first encounter with perspectives on the pandemic was reading an early intervention by Agamben that everyone has read, an early, somewhat premature essay, slightly almost crazy, but certainly a very interesting one. And while I thought I would write a piece, working through his arguments that, of course, drew on Foucault's famous discussion on the pandemic in France, in the Indiscipline and Punish, and one of his famous examples about lockdowns, an early lockdown, and yeah, that opened up many perspectives. So I wrote an essay, which I think was quite successful. 6 political philosophies in search of the virus. What I did in that piece was to relate different responses to the pandemic in the terms of political philosophy. So I identified what I thought were 6 models, and 5 of those were an alternative to Agamben's. So utilitarianism, the predominantly German Kantian response reflected Habermas's own intervention and that of others. The libertarian one, especially in the UK and especially in the US, and the Foucauldian one represented by Agamben. Well, radical polytheistic and others, and then what I refer to as nudge theory. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. My entry point was basically political philosophies. If anyone's interested, it's out there on the internet. You Google that. It's published open access in a series by the LSE. Yeah, so I then busied myself a little bit more with the whole topic to, well, identify wider perspectives. And well, I edited that book, Pandemics, Politics and Society, that Jan mentioned earlier, as a way to open up the debate. I think some interesting contributions by people like Klaus Offer and Brian Turner, Stephen Turner, and others. And well, yeah, then having produced that book, I gave further thought to the specificity of a sociological response. What would be actually a sociological approach, especially from more macro sociological analysis, and that's what I'm mostly going to talk about now. Yeah, so that was basically my entry point into it. So my talk is called Sociological Perspectives on the COVID-19 Pandemic. Maybe it should be called In Search of Sociological Perspectives, since there are none, it seems to me. And there can't really be a pure sociological perspective, I know, because adequate knowledge must surely be interdisciplinary. So accepting that as a premise, but nonetheless, the question can be posed: what actually would a sociological approach consist of, as opposed to, you know, a public health one? Now, it could be argued that COVID is not of sociological interest, but surely it is. And there is sociological literature, but it's mostly disparate on the pandemic. Yeah, so this is my concern here, is to try to unpack what a sociological approach might consist of. Right, so as an infectious disease, COVID-19 is not particularly significant, but its social and political impact has been huge. It's more than an epidemiological problem. SARS-CoV-2, the virus, it's not a super virus, despite its monumental impact. Other infectious diseases are surely more significant as infectious diseases, like AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Arguably, its impact on society has been greater than its impact on health, which is, and I'm not trivializing the impact on health, of course, and it's not to be underestimated. So, how to account for this this paradox? The pandemic is inextricably entwined in societal processes and intersects with other crises in society, as in democracy, the environment, energy, and capitalism. Well, there are basically three there: democracy, the environment, and capitalism. COVID-19 is rooted in the fundamental fact of social interaction and human mobility, so it's a very sociological pandemic. Recall someone writing at an early stage in the pandemic that the pandemic is a philosophical one. Sure it is. A lot of interesting philosophical political literature, but there's the sociological dimension. Lockdowns, mask wearing, quarantine, these all challenge the existential fact, fundamental existential fact about human beings, that they are social beings as well as political animals. And this is a challenge for sociology, because pathogens are also social and to perhaps political. And there's a conflict here of different kinds of freedom. But it's a challenge that would call it, seems, I want to say, call into question the main concepts in modern sociology. Classical sociology is not equipped at all to deal with pathogens, because too much emphasis has been in sociology on the social nature of society. Infectious diseases, what I've just said is not a particularly original thing. Latour has made much of that point. Infectious diseases played no role in the work of Weber, Simmel, or Durkheim. For Marx, microbes had no role at all in history, despite the high tide of cholera in Europe since its introduction in Europe in 1830, the time when Marx was writing, including when he was writing Capital in the late mid 1860s. It's true that the constructivist tradition since Berger and Luckmann does have something more to say. And of course, Foucault opened up important critical perspectives on biopower. And much of the sociological response to COVID has been in this mode of constructivist thinking, not too surprisingly, because it does have much to say on risk as an objective condition, etc., and as a construction of discourse. Surely there's no question about it that these open up different parts of inquiry, and everyone who is Gambin and sociological approaches are picking up on the Foucauldian approach to these things. Perhaps the work of Weber on the bureaucratic state and the predominance of instrumental rationality might be relevant in accounting for the state's response, because a lot of it is truly irrational. But much of the current situation really refutes Weber, I think. Durkheim's concern with solidarity is, of course, relevant, but only in a limited way. Yet all these thinkers were nonetheless concerned with big questions concerning the nature of modernity and major transformations in modern society. But it's not quite clear beyond that how classical sociological theory can be relevant. It raises the question of whether more recent sociological theories are more useful. Beck's risk theory is one obvious approach here, relevant to pandemics and epidemics. And as I mentioned, STS, social technology, science and technology studies, what emphasizes the big thing there is the constructive nature of scientific expertise, etc., highly pertinent and aligned with social constructionism. And I mentioned Latour is one influential approach that did bring in the non-material world and a post-social conception of society, but it does suffer from a lack of normative concern. For example, how is collective life possible? It doesn't have much to say to that, and I think that problem needs to be addressed. It's true that his recent work, which is really interesting, has addressed the more political questions about collective life, but then when he addresses these questions, he doesn't do so from the perspective of actor network theory. For me as a sociologist, I want nonetheless to look at the pandemic as relating to some of the great questions in modern sociology, especially macro-sociological analysis. I think there's a lot of interesting work from a more micro-sociological perspective and drawing on the constructivist tradition, and that makes a lot of sense. I don't want to say that's not where things should be. That has its place. I'm more interested in what the classical macro-sociological tradition might be able to contribute here. And I've tried to capture some of these themes in bringing together that volume I edited, but I think there's not enough in that. It needs to be done more systematically. So since producing the volume and the earlier essay I mentioned, I see 4 principal themes, but now they're becoming clearer to me. And I'm going to talk mostly about the first one, and I just allude really to what I think are the other 3 ones. So my main concern is the extent to which COVID-19 might be a major social transformation, because I think that's really for me at least, the big sociological question, understanding major social transformations and how should we view COVID-19 from that perspective. I'll just mention what the other three are, just to say what those are, and then very briefly talk about the other three later. The second one is the individual and the state, and there's a lot on this, mostly from more political theory perspective, especially in the book I edited. There's a lot of, I think, interesting stuff on the role of on experts and all of that. Third, nature and modernity, and fourth, the cultural significance of the pandemic. Yeah, so my question to begin with is, to what extent is COVID-19 a major social transformation, or to what extent does it relate to major social transformations that are going on? Does it herald a decline in social inequality? Probably not. Or does it point the way to a new social formation, which may not have less inequality, but different, as in the passage from feudalism to capitalism? A few historical considerations. The Antonine plague played a major role in the decline of the Roman Empire in the second half of the 2nd century Christian era, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, when apparently 10% of the population of the Roman Empire probably died of smallpox. It's not known for certain, but it does seem that decline in population was caused by smallpox, which of course is now eradicated from human societies. The Justinian plague in Constantinople in 542 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, and much earlier the decline of Athens and the rise of Sparta was the result of an epidemic. But the greatest example in history must be the Spanish conquest of the New World, with the introduction of smallpox and measles, but mostly smallpox, wiping out, I think it's one of the incredible facts of human history, 90% of the population. The Aztec kingdom fell from 30 million, it was quite populous, to just an unbelievable 3 million. And it seems too the Incas were defeated by smallpox. Now no society can recover from a loss of 90% of its population. I don't think there's anything in history comparable to that. The European elites, of course, were not unaffected. The Stuart Kingdom was effectively wiped out by smallpox. Maybe the smallpox did a little bit of good there. The 1918 flu led to the rise of national healthcare systems, the independence of India. Now, the range of issues around these events is not just one of inequality, which has been traditionally the focus of historical studies of pandemics, where generally the argument is inequality increased after major epidemics. Major epochal events go beyond the question of inequality, in my view, because I think it's ridiculous to see this as a relevant consideration in the introduction of the example I gave of smallpox to the Americas, when only 10% of the population survived, and of course they were enslaved by the Spanish masters. So it doesn't really make any sense to talk about issues of inequality here. In recent times, moving a little bit forward here, in our time, in the post-1945 period, let's just take that as a point of departure. What were the major epochal events? 9/11 surely was one. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was another. I think probably the greatest epochal event since the end of the Second World War, and I know it was more of a European Western event. But since the revolutions of 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, COVID, is perhaps the greatest event of our time in terms of its massive impact. It's probably more significant than the financial crash of 2008, 9, 10. Let me quote Adam Tooze. That's the correct pronunciation of that man's name, I'm not quite sure. Let me quote from an interesting essay I recently read. COVID-19, a disease originating in marginalized rural communities in central China, is the most sudden and savage globalization shock to date. It is the first truly comprehensive crisis of the Anthropocene era, affecting virtually everyone on the planet. It poses a far more general challenge to states and national welfare systems than the 2008 crisis did. But how to understand it? SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the disease called COVID-19, they're not the same, lacked the ferocity of the earlier SARS in 2002. Though it killed just 800 people, not very much, except for those who were amongst the 800 people. So fierce was it that it killed its hosts, thus limiting its transmission. And Ebola, probably one of the worst diseases known to humankind, was contained within Africa. To be sure, COVID is more severe as an illness than the flu, with which it's perhaps best compared. But societies have learned to live with the flu, and your deaths are something in the region of 300 to 600,000, a lot. There were 2 years, the late 50s and early 60s, when it was well more than 1 million. But societies have learned to live with the flu in ways that at the moment they're not quite willing to do with COVID. So there's some social construction going on, and there's a lot of fuss made today by people about getting vaccinations, anti-vax and all of that, anti-vax for children. It's bizarre, especially because most of these people, when they were children, were given compulsory vaccinations in the United States. And in most countries, children are given 7 more or less mandatory vaccinations. But I'm not talking about the social construction of risk and all of that. I'm interested in major social transformations. If it is a major social transformation, COVID-19 that is, it must be an event, a fundamental point of rupture. It is not self-evident as it could be it's not self-evident that it is a point of rupture, because it could be a continuation of the old, or it could be seen in terms of a model of catastrophe. This raises the question of how we should see the future. I've recently written on visions of the future in contemporary thought. Ways to see the future, I think there are 4. There's transition, as in revolution, as in rupture. There's catastrophe, breakdown. There's transformation of the present. And there's 4th, continuity. So with COVID, it can be seen as a rupture. My first one, the transition, making the transition to something new. Or it can be seen in terms of a model of continuity. Largely is a continuation of the old. But breakdown too is also possible. Catastrophe. But I would argue for 3, transformation as more appropriate, transformation of the present. This boils down to the question whether the pandemic is a cause or a consequence of change. Does it intensify changes already underway, or does it cause new developments, or at least act as a catalyst, an accelerator for change? It is, of course, both. For example, existing inequalities are deepened. There's a lot of agreement, I think, on that. Not overcome. The digital transformation in many spheres of life is given a new impetus for good and for bad work. In work, with the death of the office, depends on where you stand on that question. In higher education, in public space, the general intensification of digitalization, not just datification. I'm quoting Helga Notovi with that phrase, digitalization, not just datification. and now we have vaccine nationalism and the so-called death of truth. But there are, of course, new opportunities for progressive change, as in, reclaiming the city, more bicycle lanes and all of that, transforming the Anthropocene, or opening possibilities for democratic movements such as Black Lives Matter. Remember that. Perhaps rather than being either a point of transition or something new, or a case of nothing new, because the pre-pandemic world will not just simply bounce back unchanged, it might be best seen in terms of major social transformations occurring, not altogether as it were, but on different levels. For example, intensifying demands for democratization, different models of living, advancing new technologies like speeding up the transition to electric cars. So my model 3, transformation as opposed to catastrophic breakdown or continuity or transition, but not amounting to a new model of society, as in a model of transition. But the shape of a post-pandemic world around reflection of a new model of society can nonetheless be seen in relation to the environment, energy, travel, work, healthcare, lifestyles. But this is only because it coincides. I think this is a major claim I want to make. To the extent to which that's happening, it's only because it coincides with other changes going on. I think this is crucial. One major event intersects with other modalities of change. After all, this is what sociology can best do by way of explanation, as Max Weber also, famously argues with his notion of elective affinities, explanation by recourse to the intersection of things, as opposed to simply recourse to one cause or by reference to a multiplicity of causes. It's the intersection of a multiplicity of things that determines the shape of things. And there's the related question of globality and variability. The pandemic is a global event. We live in a globally connected era more than ever, but of course with huge variability. Which is more significant, the first truly global pandemic or its variable impacts? We're not all in the same global boat. Behind the mask lies different life experiences. But it must be both. It must be, and I'm sure Jan will agree with this because he's written on these topics, it must be both local and global. The global is not universal. I think we can agree on that, but it is articulated through the local, producing diverse outcomes in, for example, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And today, with the new variant of well, people are calling it the new variant of COVID, but of course it's not the new variant of COVID, which is a disease. It's the new variant of the virus. Well, maybe I'm just being pedantic. But this, assuming it's true, and I suppose it is true, it's coming from Africa. The fact that it's detected there doesn't mean, of course, it's really coming from there, but I think it does. But that seems to me a case of the empire striking back because of Western countries, the affluent countries, vaccinating themselves and storing up and throwing away their vaccines and not getting the rest of the world.
Shall I add in a note, Gerard? Isn't it interesting that Delta originated in India and in South Africa, Omicron, and both of these, and we can add Brazil and Peru in a different way, are enormous confluences of gene pools and cultural cross currents, and that precisely these have been excluded from vaccine production because of the patent, the hold on their patents. And South Africa was there before in HIV. It's a dramatic turn that illustrates global inequality, global apartheid, the WHO. So South Africa and India, Delta, South Africa, Botswana, Omicron, it's deeply significant. This is just a little note, Gerard.
Yes, that's not the dimension to this. Yeah, what I'm referring to here is the Empire Strikes Back. Well, that's and there really are there really major variations in world responses. There's a vast number of things. Jan has edited a book looking in part at this whole question: targeted interventions, community mobilization based lockdowns, transparency, balance between the health and politics of life, hunger and livelihoods, all of that. And I'm not an expert on the diversity of public health responses. I believe it to experts, also Jan and his colleagues have worked on this. But nonetheless, I would argue one cannot exclude the extent of global experiences, mask worry, the experience of being stationary for a time, working from home, the rush for first jabs, large numbers of people in many parts of the world. Sorry, there was someone at my door there. Large number of people, many parts of the world have had these experiences. So in many ways, it was a global event in that sense of the term. The pandemic is global in another sense that I would argue is more significant. It reveals the connected nature of societies. No one society can control a pandemic. That is, as a pandemic by definition, global. China's zero COVID policy tests this proposition, but it can't isolate itself forever by closing borders, because that basically only buys time. And this all applies to climate change as well. Pertinent here is the question: how exceptional is the pandemic in terms of new infectious diseases? I've written about this in my extended introduction to the book that I edited that I mentioned earlier. So far, just over 5 million people have died of COVID worldwide, according to WHO statistics. For the West, in Europe, it's approaching 2 million. It certainly marks the end of the period of exceptionality that was a feature of the post-1945 period, when infectious diseases were largely conquered. In this period, since 1945 in Europe and North America, the Western world, in this period, infectious diseases were replaced by lifestyle diseases. But for much of the rest of the world, COVID-19 is yet another infectious disease. Worldwide, still today, around about 1.5 people die of tuberculosis. HIV claims over 1 million, mostly in Africa. Malaria, now much reduced, around about 400,000. So yes, COVID is not insignificant. The death toll in the United States a few weeks ago, at least when I looked it up, was 675,000, is much the same as the number of people who died in the United States of the 1918 flu. But of course, one has to take into account that the population of the US at that time was much less, about a quarter of the population today. But its impact is arguably greater than the health death rate, the impact of the pandemic. Now, what does history tell us? Let me go back to this and try to pin things down a little bit more firmly. For sure, something, but not necessarily a lot. I think as the current situation is very different from earlier epidemics and pandemics. While all diseases differ necessarily as diseases, it could be said nonetheless that the political and social responses perhaps don't vary all that much. There's a tendency for the social construction of disease to take a familiar pattern. Consensus builds up very quickly in groups, as in the way expertise aligns itself with political interests. But nonetheless, despite the familiarity in responses, there does appear to be something different about COVID-19 that goes beyond the immediate social and political responses, in that it seems to mark a new orientation to the future. So let me try to identify, sociologically, what has to be present for there to be a major social transformation. I think there must be four things. Perhaps I should ideally have a slide for this, but let me make it quite simple and clear. I think for a major social transformation, we need, first of all, an event, a trigger, a causal agent of sufficient magnitude to cause fissure. So an event. Secondly, the event opens a rupture through an extended crisis. So from fissure to fracture. Other actors come to be involved. There's an alignment of actors. And there's a crisis. Yeah, so the event opens up a rupture, creating a crisis. Thirdly, this crisis leads to a breakdown in the established consensus or ideology or worldview, producing a new interpretation or a reinterpretation of the present. So a new narrative, for example. And I think quite important is the formation of narratives, a new way of looking at things. And fourth, what then emerges is a new orientation to the future, in which new paths open. Now, to reflect a little bit on that, an event that opens a rupture through a period of extended crisis, leading to a breakdown in the established consensus, producing a reinterpretation to a new orientation to the future, new paths open up. Regarding the second point, a rupture through a period of extended crisis, the event must coincide with structural change. For example, the pandemic coincided with major developments in digital technology, and to the Black Lives Matter that was at a high point at that time. And absolutely important is climate change politics. The 1918 flu coincided with the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution the previous year. The Black Death in Europe in the mid 14th century coincided with the end of feudalism. Though, depending on what account you read, there's vast literature on this, possibly also as a cause, or at least an acceleration of the end of feudalism. It depends on your approach to causality here, whether things just coincided, whether one was an influence on the other, or simply a trigger. These examples are also examples of a drop in inequality, according to historians who have researched, and Black Death is enormously researched, increasingly the 1918 flu is. But the current pandemic does not appear to be such a marker, nonetheless, as inequality appears to be greater now more than ever before. Also, it's really questionable if the Black Death and the 1918 flu, to take those comparators, really led in a meaningful sense to a drop in equality. Yet, to take the Black Death and its aftermath, a key point is one illustrated by Bruce Campbell in his book, The Great Transition, Climate, Disease and Society in the Medieval World, by Cambridge, 2016. Namely, that climate change and disease intersected, climate and disease intersected to produce a new world for the world by the end of the 15th century, so 1470s, was very different from the world before the Black Death. But that does require adding a century to the end of the Black Death to get that picture. The pandemic caused by flea-infested rats coincided with adverse weather conditions in the 14th century, leading to a major transformation in European society. So a number of things came together there. Regarding the third point of my four, the breakdown in established consensus, resulting in a reinterpretation of the present. Major change I would say is not possible without a transformation in consciousness. In most cases of pandemics, I think that can be demonstrated up to a point. There surely was a transformation in consciousness in Europe after the Black Death, leading up to the Renaissance and all of that, and after the 1918 flu, when it finally ended in 1920, there was a transformation in consciousness. In some pandemics, epidemics are contexts in which to understand major social transformations. But there's little to suggest that they're catalysts for progressive social change. The Black Death and the 1980 flu led to incredible numbers of deaths. Or it's argued the 1980 flu led to more than 50 million people dying, some say up to 100 million. The Black Death wiped out a large part of Europe's population. Such that the thing is, almost anything that came after those was almost by definition better than what went before. COVID deaths are just not significant enough in numbers, but relative and real, to lead to something comparable. So examples of a major social transformation will have to accept the perseverance of, if not more inequality, not less. I suppose, for example, that the COVID divide will match more or less the digital divide. This is one of the more, anyway, I think this is one of the more interesting macro sociological perspectives on the pandemic, and those are my thoughts on it. And I'm not sure if I used up my allocated time, but maybe I could briefly just mention the other things that I think are significant that I also try to develop in that book. The whole area of the changing relation of the individual and the state, concerning, for example, the twin dilemmas of liberty and safety on the one side and freedom and solidarity. Well, this led to a confused situation with the left having to accept the need for political measures normally associated with the right, leading to a greater crisis for the left than for the right. But the right, for sure, has also had to accept measures associated with the left, like social care, etc. And lockdowns were also shutdowns. What are the limits of the moral responsibilities of the state, and how should democracies cope with emergencies, especially in light of the fact that we're very likely to see more infectious diseases? Or what a democratic pandemic look like? I think we have to have answers for that, because they're going to be more. Or are we simply in a new dystopian era of political securitization? And that position is attractive to many scholars today. The authors in the volume I edited resisted the temptations of this Foucauldian discourse. Well, I won't say more. I think this whole position of Agamben is too extreme. And yeah, consider the recent proposals in China. Maybe you haven't heard about them, to have permanent detection centers for quarantine. That's pretty chilly. I don't know what's come of that proposal, but it was there a couple of months ago, right down from the top. Permanent detection centers for quarantine, not just be put up in good or bad hotels. As it's much discussed in the volume I did, experts have taken on a new significance, but often helpless politicians and control to experts who exert, for good or bad, considerable influence. But epidemiology is not epistemology. Democracies are in danger of the allure of technocracy. Nonetheless, the state surely requires knowledge in order to govern, and we have seen major failures in governance, especially the pathetic performances in the United States and in the UK, to say nothing of Brazil. Consensus, as I said earlier, builds up quickly in groups. This also relates to the question of what kind of knowledge is required and how societies can learn and be prepared for future events. There have been many failures in learning. Few countries really succeeded, at least for long. Those that did were mostly dictatorships. China is obviously successful, but China's a successful dictatorship. And an interesting book by Alex de Waal, New Epidemics. One of his arguments is there's no singular narrative. It's difficult to disagree with that argument. There is a wider issue here. If governments can lock down whole societies and shut down economies, surely they can stop carbon industry and control greenhouse emissions. The pandemic shows a lot about the tremendous power of the state at a time when we're supposed to believe it is weak, but it's not. In the end, the state did triumph, again, as the case of the People's Republic shows. Denmark seems to be the most successful country with a low death rate, much lower than in the UK and the US. But apparently, from what I've read, its secret was a high degree of trust in government lockdowns. Well, it's not for me to judge which countries are the most successful. That's beyond my expertise. The third one, maybe one could mention the recent experiment in Switzerland with referendums, but as we know from Brexit, referendums are a disaster, probably not a good place to go unless you have perpetual referendums every few months. Third is the wider societal historical context of nature and modernity. The great myth of modernity for a contagion-free world now looks like an illusion, despite the arrival of vaccines. It's clear, and I discussed this in my contribution to the volume I edited, that the destructive transformation of the natural world is the background to the rise of these new zoonotic infectious diseases, that is, viruses that come from animals. And this is why we're likely to see more pandemics or major epidemics in the future, unlike smallpox and measles, which were, well, I use the past tense for smallpox, it no longer is this. These were based on human hosts only. Coronaviruses involve the interaction of animal and human hosts. And just consider today, humans. We talk a lot about humans, but they're outnumbered by our farm animals. There are 19 billion chickens in the world, 1.5 billion cattle, 1 billion pigs, and another 1 billion sheep. Chickens and pigs are major vectors of viruses, by the way. It's also worth noting the paradox that while humans are destroying the planet, they're also not themselves invincible, and in fact quite weak. Humans are now beholden to the tiniest particles of life, if viruses are forms of life, a debatable issue, and which challenges all possible forms of social and political organization. So I think important for critical sociological perspectives is the centrality of pathogens to society and to human life. It's a window to view the human condition to the narrative of a disease-free world that we had in the West, but only in the West, since 1945 has been disrupted by a virus. The narrative is now a myth. Pandemics question the modern myth of control and the rational management of risk. Viruses are not aliens. Maybe this is the way to see things, but they're part of life. They're integral to life itself. And our societies are pathological in many ways. Pathology doesn't just concern health, as the Frankfurt School authors, especially Irish Fromm, once argued. The health of humans is now connected with the health of the planet. So viruses are kinds of agents, maybe Latour's sense actants perhaps. And a book that I've always been greatly inspired by, and I actually, since the pandemic, went back and read it. I still have my old copy of William McNeill's 1976 book, Plagues and People, where he presented this elegant and fascinating argument sustained over a really long, brilliant book, The Intersection of Host, Agent and Environment. That's how we should see things in this regard. And the European state itself was in part built around a defense against viruses. The centrality of pathogens is a perspective to be developed, but as I said, it's more interesting to relate it to major historical transformations. And I'll just finally mention here, all too briefly, the cultural significance of the pandemic in terms of the search for meaning in face of large-scale deaths and suffering. This, by the way, if I can just mention, was reflected in the image of the front cover of that book I edited, the painting by the Austrian expressionist Egon Schiele in 1918. He died after he painted this. He and his wife and unborn child died after that painting was made by him. Infectious diseases have been the principal cause of death throughout history. Smallpox killed more people than anything else in history, more and worse. They also reveal the fragility and vulnerability of human societies in coping with viruses and the existential challenge they pose that I think is conveyed in that famous painting. The memory and forgetting of major catastrophic events is also an important topic for the social and human sciences, as illustrated in a new interest in the 1918 flu. And one of the aspects of the 1918 flu, the sheer horror of it, did lead to much forgetting quite soon after the event, despite its transformational impact on societies. So there's a relation here of memory and forgetting going on. Of course, all memory, has been famously said, involves forgetting. But we shouldn't. But there's also, a positive story to be told here about the triumph of science through vaccination, which is, I think, one of the triumphs of modern science. So, well, this brings me back to the wider question of how we should assess the societal significance of the current pandemic in shaping contemporary societies. What is the shape of a post-pandemic society? We've had the first global exploration of what an alternative society might look like, even if it didn't lead to much change. Well, these are all questions that go to the heart of sociology and political philosophy, beyond the specialist fields of epidemiology, medical science. The pandemic reveals a great deal about the nature of society and politics. So many issues are entangled in the health crisis that it is not just a health crisis. And I've gone my time. Apologies for that. Well, thank you for listening. Let me stop at that point.
Yes, thanks, Gerard. Thanks for drawing our attention to social transformation as a core theme and to dimensions of social transformation: event, rupture, new narrative, and a new orientation towards the future. That's very interesting. I have a note, not just events, but also processes. But I see David has his hand up. Please, David. David. Oh, yeah, and Marcus. David, can you unmute? Or will you post articles? Okay, Marcus, over to you then. Oh, mic is not working. Yeah, that's all right.
Well, you could write his question or his comment.
Yeah, he does. Oh, is COVID sorry, apologies, Marcus. Is COVID a dress rehearsal for an even more serious pandemic? Is China's solution the only realistic way out? Compare with Denmark, etc. So keep this in mind, Gerard. These are David's questions or beginnings of questions. Over to Marcus and Daniel, and then combine, and we carry on from there, please.
Thank you so much, Gerard, for this really fascinating talk. So thought-provoking, so rich, so big. Before I get to my question, I just want to point to a very tragic irony when you were saying that, well, the classic founding figures of sociology don't really help us in making sense of the pandemic, that it was Max Weber who unfortunately already at age 56 passed away because of a virus, because he caught the so-called Spanish flu and died of pneumonia. So if he would have, been able to survive it, perhaps then he would have considered the importance and finished economy and society and maybe a bunch of more books, but that is just an aside. What I really want to ask is about your notion of the social transformation. There is something I couldn't quite get or understand. I think I would have totally shared with you that this is a social transformation during the first 1 or 2, perhaps even 3 months of the pandemic, during lockdown in Germany, and when overnight bicycle pathways were rolled out, where there was a kind of a social discourse about everything is now going to change. But soon enough, in the weeks, in the months afterwards, that kind of discourse seemed to have given more and more way to the call for normalcy, to a desire to return to simply where there was something pre-pandemic that was better. So for that reason, it looked more like, oh, it is maybe just going into continuity. So how can it be happen that one and the same kind of pandemic seems to lead in some phase of it towards a social transformation, but then it is already getting lost? How would you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Shall I? Regarding Weber, of course, I'm very much aware that Weber died of pneumonia due to complications from the 1918 flu. It's a fascinating question. What would he, had he lived much longer? He died ridiculously young. What would he have said? Would he? I think he would have had to reconsider the fundamental presuppositions of his theory of the iron cage, and the relentless process of rationalization, because as you quite well know, especially in Germany and the Central European world, things just fell apart after the war and another war. And yeah, I think the course of Western societies, or after Weber's death of 1918, just can't be understood in the terms of his theories. I suppose he would have to rethink his theories. And yeah, okay, maybe that's a small comment, but yes, no, I agree. And that's an opportunity for me to clarify something that maybe I didn't make sufficiently clear, because I didn't elaborate sufficiently on it. No, I'm not saying that, because I don't think it can be said that the pandemic is itself a major social transformation or leading to a one. I think the extent to which that could be a meaningful claim would have to be more in terms of how different things come together. So it wouldn't be the pandemic on its own, but it would be the pandemic in combination with other major factors, like, for example, climate change politics. A number of things would have to come together. That would be one response. So not the pandemic on its own. I think there's not enough there, except in relation to certain things. So a model of social transformation as opposed to one of the other conceptions of the future. So I'm arguing against the first conception of transition. The pandemic is leading to something new. I'm arguing for a model of transformation, and that could be understood in two ways, at least two ways. One is one I just said, where a number of major things come together, and that I think would have to be an open question of what would happen then as a result, but there would be a way to formulate it. And secondly, perhaps in respect to certain things, not necessarily everything. So you can have significant change on one level, but not necessarily on other levels. As in the example of inequalities, it doesn't seem that inequalities are going to become less. They may even become more. But it's likely, to take a more obvious example, it's likely there's going to be a tremendous transformation. It's already happening in the nature of work, not necessarily for everyone, but certain kinds of work are more likely to be transformed as a result of the pandemic. So I think one would have to look at it. I absolutely agree. The turn to normalcy, that's the word you used, normalcy. Yes, I mean, I've already said when I was talking formally earlier, here in Barcelona where I live, there's a strong desire for things to go back to normality, whatever normality is. And yeah, that's one aspect of people's response to desire for normality. And though it doesn't necessarily mean that because people want normal life that it's going to come back. The pre-pandemic world, I think, probably won't bounce back unchanged. There'll be significant changes on some things. Yeah, Helga notably has made a really excellent argument. She's got a fine chapter in my book. She's just published a book on digitalization of Polity Press. Argument is that the pandemic has speeded up digitalization. The fact that we're all reasonably competent with the technology that we're all using here, Zoom, as an example. So I guess that would be my result. But absolutely clear, a major social transformation must involve a number of things coming together.
Please, Gerard, I see questions. Daniel Palm, Habib Kontker, would you combine them, please? A bit succinct, and we can, please, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for the vocabulary for thinking about transformations. I like it. And I wonder, on empirical grounds, wouldn't it be that the biggest transformation we're probably going to be stuck with is on the labor market? The death of the office was already quoted today. There is definitely a reorientation that already impacted business as usual in gastronomy. People left the sector. Education is in change. Production, there's a reorganization of supply chains going on where risk is being factored into production costs. So, and this all combined even with a demographic shift, especially in Europe, labor getting scarce, labor also getting negotiating power, something in the US that was discussed this summer, that people who left the jobs were reconsidering whether they really want to re-enter the jobs they left in the first place. And I would think this is probably something that is a transformation that has happened in the transatlantic region at least. And yeah, it's a comment. Let's see if questions emerges a bit. Yeah, would you see a bigger impact in transformatic terms than the labor market?
I'm trying to get questions.
Hang on, please, Gerard. Combine, please, with Habib's question, okay? Please.
Sorry, Jan, could I ask Daniel, just the very last thing he said, could you kindly just reformulate the last sentence?
Yeah, it was my intent to turn it into a question. would you try to argue for a sector in society that has gone through a bigger transformation than
yes,
the labor
okay.
market?
Understood, yeah.
Habib.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, but those trends like the demographic shift and its impact on labor shortage, even in China in the coming days, I mean, these things were secular trends irrespective of COVID. But I was thinking of, if we look at sociology, I mean, this is a good point, but as Arundhati Roy said, that it's a portal. But then we realize that it's not really a portal in the sense that major changes are going to take place that would not have taken place without COVID. I mean, some of those changes like digitalization and so on, they were actually, they began, before, way before, COVID came in. So the transformational aspect, I think, needs to be thought a little bit more carefully, because one of the consequences, or two consequences, which are interrelated. One is that the states have been more empowered politically, regardless of the political economy. And all states have become bigger in terms of spenders, not just US, but every state everywhere is spending more money. And this has given them an excuse for that, and it has wider economic impacts. But I was also thinking of very specific areas of sociology that could be mentioned or that could be addressed. One is sociology of disaster. There is this sort of branch in sociology, and they're looking at all kinds of disasters. And this, pandemic gave them an opportunity to bring their conceptual resources to bear on this. And another field is sociology of space, because the density of population, how people live. Environmental sociologist and Marcus is here. So suddenly I remember that sociology of future. All these branches of sociology can also come into play in dealing with this pandemic. And maybe you have another book to consider to bring in all these different perspectives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for those comments. Regarding Habib's, I think there are 2 points there. I can only agree with your latter comments. If I just take yours first, that there are these other subfields within sociology that are now more interesting or more, relevant to looking at these big questions, disaster, space, and theories of the future. I'm interested especially in the latter. And that these can have a new significance, absolutely. But your first point, I certainly would accept that it's a valid counter argument to what I said, or at least that it's a point that would need to be more taken into account in what I have said, because if I got it correctly, maybe my notion of social transformation rests too much on a notion of acceleration or things being speeded up. And I suppose conceptually, it's questionable, that because something goes faster doesn't mean that things have fundamentally changed. But conceptually, I think what I would need to work out more clearly here is, by going faster, things being accelerated, digitalization being accelerated, the death of the office, whatever examples you want to take, transformation of work, or etc. That these, by going faster, as it were, it may or may not be the case that they've changed as a result, but maybe more significant is what that I mentioned earlier. By going faster, they're intersecting with other developments. And then it might be more a matter of the overall shape of things. And I've postulated certain things coming together, the pandemic in all these different dimensions, some more important than the other. And then outside that, climate change politics, it's obviously absolutely central to the present. And these connecting, maybe we'll see in the future how they connect much more visibly, other pandemics, epidemics, or simply going to happen. We shouldn't be sociologists in the business of making predictions. I'm not trying to predict, but on the basis of the way things are at the moment, the whole history of zoonotic diseases, it's reasonable to assume that there will be other ones. And that way we can see them. Just take the connection, just take the trivial example of most coronaviruses, I understand it, come from bats that are transmitted to human populations via vector animals. And just take the example of deforestation that uproots certain types of bats, fruit bats, I think, and other types, and they go and inhabit urban areas. That's been the background to several, including Ebola, of major infectious diseases, epidemics, and the current pandemic. So there's already a connection there. Anyway, I would want to develop it more like that, but I accept that a simple model of acceleration of things going faster isn't sufficient for a transformation, or would be unlikely. It would have to be a massive transformation. I mentioned, like, electric cars, the technology for electric cars is getting faster, but the whole history of the motor car has been a history of incredibly slow changes in car manufacture. And the previous point, the previous question, I must say I don't have an answer to that question. If I got it correctly, is there a sector that's more significant than other ones? I guess I don't have an answer to that at the moment that would have the consideration necessary to
Gerard,
be interested.
let me slip in a question. I think your key contribution is the focus on transformation and dimensions of transformation. Now, there where you begin, you say event, rupture, and so forth. The emphasis on event and sudden rupture obscures the importance of processes. Big processes I have in mind are the resurgence, the comeback of Asia over a long period of time, include China, of course. Another process is climate change. Now, East Asia turns out to be the most adept at dealing with the pandemic also. So that, and then Agamben's point about state of exception, authoritarian state, it is rather what we see in several cases, state ineptitude, the absence of state power. And instead we have market authoritarianism, which is expressed in big pharma's role, holding on to patents, blocking the WHO, and contributing to a globalization, a further globalization of the pandemic. Then in relation to transformation, as some people already indicate, and yourself too, there is also the lack of transformation, and it is the lack of transformation, market forces, market fundamentalism, big pharma in the lead, and the distribution of power is such that the US and the UK do not block them, and so we see lack of transformation in the Anglo-American world, keeping the world, as it were, in a bottleneck or in a deep freeze. The world cannot move. And financialization and tax havens and 2008, etc., is part of that also. So a lack of transformation that is contributing to another kind of transformation. So the interplay between no transformation and transformation is maybe an interesting one. And approaches a la Agamben completely obscure that.
Yeah, valuable comments, Jan. I agree. It does seem to be the case that the so-called advanced or old democracies are having more problems than more recent new democracies or ones that are not democracies in coping with the pandemic. And because I think you mentioned big processes. Well, I would like to think that they're in my model, but a difficulty certainly is macro sociological theorizing is really difficult, because what are the where these set the limits. So I think surely at some level, yes, world regions, it needs to be unpacked in terms of world regions, perhaps not just nations, but world regions. Some generalization is necessary, otherwise we just can't do anything. And it's not so interesting looking at some countries. You mentioned, East Asian countries are more successful. I don't have the expertise that you have to question that, but my reading suggests that Denmark is pretty successful. Hard to beat it. Maybe somewhere in East Asia they're more successful. Is China successful? Well, yes, it is. But look at what cost and for how long.
Thinking of South Korea and Taiwan, rather,
okay.
right?
Yeah,
okay.
Good examples. Yeah, yeah, sure. Obviously, very different examples from People's Republic. But yeah, I suppose one would have to do this on a world regional level. Otherwise, there will be the problems that you have raised.
Gerard, I see a question of Ricardo, please.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. You talked earlier about the social transformation and consciousness. And earlier you were expressing confidently that the Omicron originated in South Africa, but there are news reports that it's first detected in Europe. And so I want the colonial mindset, how a pandemic and the variants are now being weaponized in the way in which the former colonies were responding, or Europe as a bloc. And do you see that transformation and the entrenchment of sort of a colonial way of responding to this politics, the new politics of variance, and that we are not seeing a conscious transformation in consciousness in the way in which the state respond? And is the state's response a reflection of European societies, either right-wing march or the old colonial way of thinking about pandemics and how it is weaponized? The Spanish flu is a classic example, or even though its point of origin is somewhere else. And so I'm just, if you think about this macro changes in consciousness, is that not all, to tie it to Jan's earlier point about blockages and lack of transformation? Are we reverting back to the old colonial mindset?
Yes, surely. And there's that famous book by Susan Sontag on the 1970s on infectious illness as a metaphor. She said, diseases come by definition from somewhere else, and that's been part of the whole history of epidemics. And they have come to the West from the East, and then of course that's all tied up with all kinds of post-colonial, colonial imagery and so on. But I would say, I agree. But I would just also comment that there's still a lot of people today arguing, and they will, I'm sure, be proven to be right when this whole business is over in a few years. It will be over. That the fundamental mistake is not to vaccinate the populations in the less developed world, and that recalls been reading about him recently, Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish politician and social democrat who associated with the formation of the Swedish welfare state, who argued for a world welfare state. And when you're dealing with global pandemics, well, that's a contradiction in terms of pandemic is by definition global, that vaccinating your own population is not going to solve the problem for one's own society for very long if you're not vaccinating the rest of the world. And I think that would probably become more an important position. And some people are waking up to that right now. But the problem is politicians are thinking in the short term. And but I think that's already an example of a transformation in consciousness. And I'm maybe emphasizing a little bit more the generally global dimensions of the pandemic in terms of maybe a normative response in even countries like the UK.
A transformation of consciousness, but then a transformation of the distribution of power would also help.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, well, the arguments have to be there first. And yeah, of course, but without the arguments, without transformation in moral consciousness in that direction,
I happen to be living in the United States, and what strikes me day after day, year after year, over a long period, is the stagnation, the lack of change. And I observed that in California, uses seventh largest, sixth largest economy of the world, a rail track that goes back to 1885. It's the same rail track between San Diego and Sacramento, 1885. Transformation, but where?
It's for sure not everywhere.
Gerard, another interesting dimension you bring up is that it is the combination, the articulation, the intersection of crises that can bring about change. And this is unexplored. And I notice the relation with market power, big pharma is one. Financialization is one. There's a series of, and inequality is one. And this also relates to the power of states and global debt, states spending more, etc. That is however, the consciousness of that articulation is not growing. It's hardly explored, hardly articulated. And this is a key issue. How do these crises intersect and combine? And what does this combination trigger? Climate change, financialization, market authoritarianism, inequality, how do they interact with COVID transformations? This is inspiring an interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the comment, Jan. Yeah, I agree. These are, well, for me, the issues. Just a question of, what kind of sociological angle are you coming at the thing from? I'm interested in, well, my starting point is perspectives in critical theory that try to understand the present in terms of different forces interacting with each other, the dialectical conception of society. And the example you mentioned in the US of right sway to society seemingly not changing, that may not be right, but of course, that's one way of looking at things remaining stagnant or unchanging, though I suspect that there's greater change going on than might be suggested by that image. But I'm interested in the contradictions that are nonetheless present, and the whole story about COVID is one full of contradictions, and almost any example that you can take could be analyzed in terms of its inherent contradictions, and the analysis of which then might reveal different responses.
Gerard, I think you have been inspiring a wonderful discussion about transformation, also the lack of it. And not only do I want to thank you, but also because it's the last conversation in our series for this quarter, I want to thank Brett Aho. Thank you, Brett. Katie Randon for helping us out. To all the speakers and the participants, thank you very much for joining in. This is a digital conversation, but it's such a nice resource to have this conviviality also. David, and there you are back. Marvelous. Gerard, thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for chairing this and hosting it, and to the participants for their comments.
Thanks much, everybody. Gerard, okay, Brett, over to you.
Yeah. So as Jan said, this is the last of the year. So we'll be kicking off again in January with our winter series. Keep your email inboxes posted for our announcement, which will come out sometime, I don't know, in a couple weeks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Marvelous. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.